Verse 311. It is a man's mind that is perceived as something resembling the form of a star, a cloud, a moon, a sun, and what is thus perceived by them is born of habit energy. So the man's mind is perceived as something resembling the form of a star, a cloud, a moon, a sun. So what are these four things then? Well, they're all natural sources of light. And in the days before we were swamped with artificial electric lighting, these sources of light would have been very important. People in the desert often travelled at night, in the coolness of the night, and their only light on many occasions would have been the light of the stars and the light of the moon. We don't normally think of clouds as a source of light, but clouds often reflect the light, just as the source of the moon's light is reflected light, and they also diffuse the light. So I think our ancestors, in looking up at the sky, would have seen clouds as something to do with light. So in what way are these like the mind? Well, what does light do? Light brings things into vision. It makes things visible. And this is what the mind does. It allows us to perceive things. So this verse is actually the first of a sequence that follows, to do with the nature of the physical world. In the previous few videos we were concerned with the 5 dharmas, which are the 5 factors of enlightenment practice, or we could describe them as the 5 elements of enlightenment practice. These elements are fundamental, and in putting into practice these elements of enlightenment practice, we have to review our relationship with the external world and the understanding that it's made up of physical elements. So this is what we're looking at now. So the mind operates in a similar way to sources of light. It makes things perceptible. And the point here it's making is that this isn't an objective process. It isn't simply illuminating what is there. What we perceive is actually dependent on our own habit energy. And this is a combination of what we're led to perceive, and also how what we perceive is also a result of our own moods, our own psychological disposition. So this is the point. You think, here's a mobile phone. That's an objective thing, surely. I'm perceiving that. What could be more straightforward than that? There's light shining on it. There's light shining on it. I'm aware of it. It's a mobile phone. What's that got to do with our moods, our psychological disposition, our habit energy? Well, this is a great example actually, because in that are all the assumptions which limit us. The assumption that this is a neutral physical object. What happens if you lose your mobile phone? If this was such a simple, neutral, physical object, no big deal. You lose your mobile phone, maybe your purse gets stolen, you've lost your credit cards, your address book. Is it the bit of plastic that you're worried about? The bit of technology? The bits of paper? No, no. There's a whole psychology that comes into play, isn't there? But we like to kid ourselves, don't we? We like to ignore all that and just say, and try and pretend that we're rational and say, it's an object. I'm perceiving an object. End of story. It's almost some kind of denial. So what we're looking at here is the habit energy. That's what's real. That's the reality we actually live in accordance with. We don't live in accordance with some neutral, objective, external, physical reality made up of atoms. That's the reality we might read about in textbooks, but it's not the reality we live by. We live in the reality of our habit energy. But even all that aside, even if we were to give this more than a passing thought as a physical object, we make certain assumptions. We assume that this is something out there, something completely independent of me, something completely independent of my perception. If pressed, we'll say it's made up of atoms, whatever that means. But we'll say that. We'll say it's made up of atoms. It works by electricity. This is assuming we know what atoms and electricity are. I don't think that's very straightforward. So we're assuming that there's an underlying reality to this. We're assuming that it's made up of something. We can take it apart and see that it is actually made up of bits. And we assume that process continues on. And there's an assumption that there is some fundamental level where we'll break it down into its uniform components, its uniform constituents. Maybe it's strings or whatever, quarks. The assumption is that everything is made up of uniform components. And I'll say more about this in the next video.